Good evening, America. Tonight, this war produced a scandal that has no precedent in modern diplomatic history. Iran leaked the deal, not rumors about the deal, not an interpretation of the deal, not anonymous sources describing what might be in the deal. Iran's own official state news agency published what it described as the 7 main points of the signed memorandum of understanding between the United States and Iran in black and white, on the record, with specifics. And what those 7 points revealed, the version of the deal Iran published for the entire world to read, made the Trump administration erupt in fury. Trump went on Truth Social within hours and called it fake news. He said Iran's terms have nothing to do with the terms that were agreed to in writing. He called the Iranians very dishonorable people to deal with. He said with them there is no such thing as dealing in good faith. Vice President Vance went on social media and said he has seen a lot of fake information about a potential deal. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt stood at the podium and said Iran's version was not the deal America agreed to. And a senior U.S. official went on background and described a completely different deal, one where Iran's nuclear program would be dismantled, all nuclear materials destroyed and removed, and none of Tehran's frozen assets released until Iran delivers in full. 2 deals, same war, same negotiating table, 2 completely different documents being described to the public by the 2 sides sitting at that table. And tomorrow, Trump was supposedly planning a signing ceremony in Europe with Vice President Vance as the American representative. Tonight, we are going to go through every detail of what Iran published, every word of what Trump said in response, and what the gap between those 2 versions of the deal tells you about whether peace is actually coming or whether the world is about to be played. Stay with me, because this is the most important story this channel has ever covered. Let us start with what Iran actually published, because you deserve to hear every single point in plain English before hearing anyone's response to it. Iran's official state news agency, IRNA, published what it described as the 7 main points of the Memorandum of Understanding agreed between the United States and Iran. Here is what Iran said the deal contains, point by point. Point 1. A full ceasefire on all fronts, including in Lebanon. No carve-outs, no exceptions for Israeli operations against Hezbollah. A comprehensive, total ceasefire covering every military front simultaneously. Point 2. The initial unfreezing of $12 billion in Iranian funds held in foreign banks. Not all of Iran's frozen assets, $12 billion as an initial release, with more presumably to follow in later stages of a final agreement. Point 3, normalization of passage through the Strait of Hormuz and maritime security. Not surrender of Iranian authority over the strait. Not free and unrestricted passage as America has been demanding. Normalization of passage. Iran's state media is describing a deal where Iran retains management authority over the strait, and the deal establishes a framework for normal traffic within that managed environment. Point 4, no new agreements have been reached on Iran's nuclear program. Read that again. No new agreements on the nuclear program. The deal, according to Iran's published version, does not address the nuclear question in any substantive way. It simply says that new nuclear negotiations will begin 60 days after the MOU is signed. Iran's nuclear enrichment continues. Iran's stockpile of 972 pounds of 60% enriched uranium stays where it is. The nuclear question is deferred. Point 5, the lifting of certain sanctions related to food, medicine, and humanitarian goods. Not the lifting of oil sanctions, not the lifting of financial sanctions. Humanitarian-related sanctions, relief only. Point 6, continuation of diplomatic efforts toward a comprehensive peace agreement to be negotiated in the 60-day follow-on window. Point 7, a commitment by both sides to refrain from further military escalation during the implementation period. That is Iran's version of the deal. And if you have been following this channel, you already know why Trump exploded when he read it. Because that version of the deal is almost exactly what Iran was offering before the war started. No nuclear concessions in the first phase. Humanitarian sanctions, relief only. Iranian management of the strait retained. $12 billion in asset release up front. That is a deal that gives Iran everything it has been demanding and gives America a ceasefire, a partially reopened strait, and a promise that nuclear talks will start in 60 days. A promise from people Trump just called very dishonorable, who cannot deal in good faith. Now let us go to Trump's reaction, because it was immediate, furious, and revealing in ways that go far beyond the specific words he used. Trump posted on Truth Social and called Iran's published terms fake news. He said, and I am going to give you the direct quotes because every single word matters here. The terms that Iran leaked out to the fake news have nothing to do with the terms that were agreed to in writing. What they said, including their weak and pathetic statement on having a deal, bears no relation to the truth. Very dishonorable people to deal with. With them, there is no such thing as dealing in good faith. He also accused Iran of continuing to target ships in the Strait of Hormuz with drones and warned that they better get their act together and fast. Now, parse those words carefully, because Trump is saying something very specific that deserves your full attention. He said the terms Iran leaked have nothing to do with the terms that were agreed to in writing. In writing, Trump is confirming that there is a written agreement. He is not saying there is no deal. He is saying the deal Iran published is not the deal that exists in writing. That is a critical distinction. America and Iran have a written document. Both governments have signed or initialed something, but they are publicly describing completely different versions of what that document says. That is not a communications problem. That is not a translation error. That is two governments that have been at war for 105 days, trying to tell their own domestic audiences that they won the negotiation. Iran is telling its people it got $12 billion up front, kept its nuclear program, kept its strait authority, and got a comprehensive Lebanon ceasefire. America is telling its people that Iran's nuclear program will be dismantled, all nuclear materials destroyed and removed, none of Iran's frozen assets released until Iran delivers in full, and the strait will be free and open. Both of those cannot be the document that was agreed to in writing. One of them is the truth. One of them is a government lying to its own people and to the world. And Vice President Vance's response adds another layer that is just as revealing. Vance wrote on social media that he had seen a lot of fake information about a potential deal to reopen the strait and end Iran's nuclear weapons program. He used the phrase Iran's nuclear weapons program, not Iran's nuclear enrichment capability, not Iran's advanced nuclear research, Iran's nuclear weapons program. That language is significant. America is describing this deal as ending a weapons program. Iran's published version says the deal makes no new agreements on the nuclear program at all. If Vance is describing a deal that ends Iran's nuclear weapons program, and Iran's state news agency is describing a deal that makes no new agreements on the nuclear program, those are not two descriptions of the same document. Those are two completely different deals. Now let us bring in the senior U.S. official who spoke on background, because their description of the deal the Trump administration is claiming it agreed to is the most detailed American account of what the agreement actually contains. A senior Trump administration official stated that under the emerging deal, Iran's nuclear program would be dismantled, all nuclear materials would be destroyed and removed, and Iran would not be able to continue funding terrorist proxies in the region. The official added that the deal would be performance-based and none of Tehran's frozen assets would be released until Iran fulfills its part in the agreement. Dismantled, destroyed, and removed, cannot fund proxies, performance-based, no frozen assets released until delivery. That is not the same deal as $12 billion up front, no new nuclear agreements, humanitarian sanctions only, and normalization of passage with Iranian authority retained. Those are not the same document described in different ways. Those are fundamentally different frameworks for what happens to Iran's nuclear program, its proxy funding, and its frozen assets. And one of these governments is lying about what they agreed to. Here is what makes this leak so strategically explosive and why Iran did it. Iran leaked its version of the deal today on the eve of a planned signing ceremony in Europe tomorrow because it wants to lock in the public narrative of what was agreed before Trump can present his version at a signing ceremony. If Iran's version of the deal is out in the world, published by state media, accepted as the framework by international observers, before Trump stands up at a signing ceremony and describes the deal in his terms, then Trump's description will be seen as the spin. Iran is trying to write the history of this deal before it is signed. And by doing so, Iran is trying to make it politically impossible for Trump to walk the deal back, to demand more concessions, or to present the outcome as a total American victory. Iran is telling the world that it did not surrender its nuclear program. It is telling the world it kept $12 billion. And it is daring Trump to contradict that in public. And Trump did contradict it in the most furious and explicit terms possible, which means the signing ceremony that was supposed to happen tomorrow is now in jeopardy because Trump cannot stand in front of cameras in Europe and sign a document while simultaneously calling Iran's description of that document fake news and very dishonorable. That contradiction would define his presidency's most consequential diplomatic moment as a charade. Either Trump describes the deal the way Iran described it, in which case his own supporters will say he surrendered, or Trump describes the deal the way his senior officials described it, in which case Iran will walk away from the ceremony saying the American version bears no relation to the truth. This is what the MOU leak actually did. It did not reveal the deal. It poisoned the signing. Now let us bring in two key reactions from American political figures that tell you how the Republican hawks who supported this war are receiving tonight's development. Senator Lindsey Graham, who has been one of the most vocal critics of the deal framework throughout this entire war, saw Iran's published version and used it as confirmation of everything he has been warning about. Graham had previously called the prospective deal a disaster, questioned why the war was fought at all if this is where it ends, and said giving Iran any control of the strait would signal that Iran had a weapon more powerful than a nuclear bomb. Iran's leaked version, with its language about normalization of passage and no new nuclear agreements, is precisely what Graham predicted and precisely what he said would be a disaster. His reaction tonight was fury. And here is something that happened just this week that adds yet another layer to the complexity of where this war stands as of tonight. Trump threatened to pull back strikes against Iran and then called them off, telling reporters that Iran's supreme leader had approved a proposed settlement. But then Iran leaked its version of that settlement, and Trump called it fake. And now America is waiting to see whether tomorrow's signing ceremony happens or collapses under the weight of two governments that cannot agree on what they agreed to. Time magazine, Bloomberg, and the New York Times all reported this week that the United States and Iran are edging closer to signing an agreement, that the G7 meeting next week in Canada could provide the diplomatic backdrop for a formal announcement, and that substantial progress has been made from broad understandings to a written framework that both sides now largely support. That is the optimistic picture. But the optimistic picture was published before Iran's state media published 7 points that Trump called fake news. And the 48 hours between now and the G7 may determine whether the Iran war ends or enters its most dangerous escalatory phase yet. What both versions of the deal share, and this is critical, is the 60-day follow-on nuclear negotiation. Both Iran and America acknowledge that nuclear talks will follow the signing of a memorandum. The question is whether those talks begin with Iran having already surrendered its nuclear program, as America's version implies, or whether those talks begin with Iran having made no new nuclear agreements, as Iran's version states. That difference is not a detail. It is the entire substance of the war. America fought for 105 days to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon. The deal's first phase either starts with that accomplished or with it deferred. And two governments are publicly saying opposite things about which of those realities describes the document they both claim to have agreed to in writing. Lebanon's death toll rose again today. The Lebanese health ministry confirmed at least 3,670 people have been killed since March 2nd, more than 10,000 wounded, more than 1 million displaced. Iran's leaked deal says a full ceasefire on all fronts, including Lebanon, is part of the agreement. If that is true, the Lebanon war should end when the MOU is signed. If Trump's version is true and Iran's leaked terms have nothing to do with the actual agreement, then the Lebanon ceasefire terms remain unresolved, and the fighting that has killed 3,670 people will continue. 3,670 people whose fate depends on which version of this deal is real. Here is the full picture as of tonight, June 13th, 2026, day 105 of this war. Iran's state media published 7 points of the MOU, including $12 billion in asset release, no nuclear concessions, and Iranian authority over the Strait of Hormuz retained. Trump called it fake news and called Iran very dishonorable people who cannot deal in good faith. Vance said there is a lot of fake information about the deal. A senior U.S. official described a completely different deal where Iran's nuclear program is dismantled, no assets released until delivery, and Iran cannot fund proxies. A signing ceremony with Vance representing America was supposed to happen this weekend in Europe. Trump called off fresh strikes against Iran, saying Iran's supreme leader had approved a settlement. Then Iran published its version of that settlement, and Trump called it fake. The G7 meets next week in Canada. The Strait of Hormuz has seen 2 Iranian drone attacks this week. Lebanon has seen 3,670 people killed. And the most important diplomatic document of this century may or may not say what either government is telling the public it says. America, here's my question for you tonight, and it is the most direct one this channel has ever asked. Iran published the deal. Trump called it fake. One of them is lying. A senior U.S. official says Iran's nuclear program will be dismantled and no money released until Iran delivers. Iran's state media says no new nuclear agreements and $12 billion up front. Both cannot be the same document. So here is my question for you. Who do you believe? Do you believe Trump when he says the real deal includes dismantling Iran's nuclear program and no money until Iran delivers? Or do you believe Iran's published version showing no nuclear concessions and $12 billion up front? Drop your answer in the comments right now. This is the single most important question of this entire war, because the answer determines whether America won or lost 105 days of war. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The signing ceremony is supposed to happen tomorrow. We will be here the moment it does or the moment it falls apart.